Oscar-winning special effects creator Ray Harryhausen and I will discuss the creation of one of the finest fantasy adventure films ever made. Jason and the Argonauts was the fourth of the grand fantasy films made by Ray Harryhausen and producer Charles H. Schneer. They were to make 5 more such films together, but none would combine the range of special effects, the vibrancy of performance and script, or the vitality of directing that was found in Jason. Ray Harryhausen reflects on Jason and its evolution from his early life and career.
Jason is one of my favorite pieces, I believe, because it was our first venture into Greek mythology. The creatures were all built into the story. You didn't have to invent too many. You had to modify them. You had to get new concepts, just as in Clash of the Titans. We had to take the basic concepts of the mythology and modify it for the use in films. Greek mythology, I think, has never been put on the screen before to any great degree outside of sort of these muscle men type of pictures, which are not really the essence of mythology any more than Arabic fantasies are supposed to be girly shows, the way they stage them in Hollywood. So I guess Jason appealed to me because of this innate basis of philosophy within the story, as well as the idea that you could put on the screen creatures of a never land that nobody has ever seen on the face of this earth before. One thing I think you might find interesting is the fact that in the early days when we made the black and white films, we were always connected with monsters on the loose. And when Seventh Voyage came about, I was trying to get away from that type of thing of just one big monster trampling down a city. You can only do that so many times. So I ransacked the Arabian Nights and came up with the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. And then we made Seventh Voyage and Gulliver, which was different, and Mysterious Island. And then we tried to find another avenue, and of course Greek mythology is a wonderful thing because the creatures, these strange, grotesque ideas are all built into the original stories. So you don't have to force them in. They come about naturally. You have to rearrange Greek mythology many times because it doesn't have a continuity that is suitable for films. So you manipulate the whole thing, and it made a whole new avenue, mythology, for the use of stop-motion animation.
You will conquer tonight.
I got my influence of dinosaurs, of course, by reading books and seeing Charles Knight's wonderful paintings that he made for the American Museum of Natural History in New York. I had a hobby of making small reproductions of saber-toothed tiger and the mammoth and various other things. I used to like to make little dioramas that I saw in the museum and try to duplicate them. I think in my early days at school, in grammar school, I remember our teacher gave us a mission of making the missions of California in 3 dimensions. And that was one of the projects. I think I did about 4 or 5 in clay of the various missions along the coast of California. And that really, when I look back, stimulated me into having more of an interest in dimensional objects rather than flat drawings. So that was largely responsible, I think, for my interest in sculpture. And of course, I had a great curiosity. I always wanted to know what's on the other side of the mountain. I used to haunt the museum, and then, of course, I saw the wonderful displays down in the basement. They had what they called a motion picture room, with clippings of how matte shots were made and how traveling mattes were made, the Williams process, the Dunning process. So all those things, exposure to this wonderful Los Angeles museum really was responsible for starting my interest in paleontology. I couldn't find another soul that was really as interested as I was. I seemed to be unique, and of course, in those days, if you didn't think in a certain pattern, you were thought to be a little kind of an oddball. I remember my first meeting with Forey Ackerman and the group down in the Little Brown Room at Clifton's Cafeteria. It was a science fiction league. We used to be a group of young people who would love to talk among ourselves about going to the moon and traveling to Mars and spaceships. We had an Egyptologist there, and we had various people who had unusual interests, intense unusual interests. And Ray Bradbury was among them. He was just starting out as a writer. So every Thursday evening we had this wonderful get-together. And of course, if you spoke about these type of things on the outside, people thought you were a little weird. Space platforms, who would ever hear of having a platform up in space? Who would ever hear of a satellite? But I think we were ahead of our time.
I serve the gods.
Ray was a budding writer, Ray Bradbury, and he, of course, got a lot of rejection slips, and Forey Ackerman was really his first editor. Forey published at the time a magazine called Imagination, and Ray used to write for that, and I did some illustrations. I used to like to make strange, grotesque-looking characters called ghouls, and Ray lived in one section of town, and I lived quite a distance away, so we used to do a lot of our conversation by telephone. Fortunately, in those days, the telephone prices per minute was not very strong, and we talked for hours about our thoughts and our dreams. He wanted to be one of the world's greatest writers, and I wanted to follow in the footsteps of Willis O'Brien and make the definitive dinosaur picture. So all our dreams were aired over the telephone a great deal. That was our bond between us, that our interest in dinosaurs, prehistoric animals, the strange qualities of never-never-land creatures. When I look back, it was one of the best parts of my life, I suppose.
Kill Jason, and you kill yourself.
We had an effect around the gods because we wanted to isolate them so that when you cut to them, you didn't feel that was a normal life. So we had a device made where smoke and fumes sort of emanated from the center of the screen, enough so that you could see the image in the middle. And I think that it worked quite well for that sequence, that whenever you cut to the gods, that you knew you were definitely in a fairy tale land, an imaginary land of the gods.
He will avenge you.
How?
Beverly Cross's depiction of the bickering between Niall McGuinness's Zeus and Honor Blackman's Hera seems on target. It's also very evocative of Victorian and Edwardian satire.
I want to help Jason.
No.
If you know about Greek mythology, you realize that the Greeks thought of their gods as simply large people up in Mount Olympus. There's more to it than that, but Hera, for example, the goddess in Olympian menagerie of gods, and Niall McGuinness plays Zeus, and Honor Blackman plays Hera. The gods, we wanted to get a stimulus that they had control, were manipulating people like puppets, and hence we have the scene, which you'll see shortly, of them playing checkers with humanity. And all these symbols come in that they control the destiny of man, and that they're always watching down upon the populace to guide the destiny, the fickle finger of fate, you might call them.
The man with one sandal.
Some people just don't have the type of face that would fit in the Greek period. Although they may be excellent actors, we tried to get them to look like the characters and who would look good in a costume. But I think these people, particularly the character actors, were the classic actors of England, where they all look at home in a costume. And many Americans, sometimes, they look ill at ease when they get in a toga. The smoke effect was done, of course, in an optical printer. We shot the smoke separate. Then we made a mat, the shape of Hera, and had the mat superimposed over the smoke so that it created the image.
In many respects, Jason, whom we're seeing for the first time in the guise of Todd Armstrong, is the quintessential classic mythic hero. He is of mysterious birth, origin, and upbringing, and he has come to Thessaly to rectify an injustice done to him, his family, and his people. This sounds like nothing new to anyone who has ever watched a Western. This sort of hero is familiar to fans of John Wayne and Clint Eastwood alike. But the Greeks and their antecedents had them thousands of years ago. Jason is simply one of the most enduring of these mythic heroes.
Then I can put you on your way.
Todd Armstrong was chosen for Jason. He was a contact player at Columbia, and I think he did quite a good job with his role that he portrayed there. I first met George Pal, that was in the late 30s, I would say. I first saw an ad in the paper that he was going to make a series of puppetoons for Paramount Pictures. And I went over to the studio and showed him some of my footage that I had made for a film I never completed called Evolution. And he saw my interest in stop motion and he hired me. So I was one of the first animators he had on his production team. And I did most of the animation. I did about 12 pictures with him. I worked with George for 2.5 years before the war. And his style of puppet making was stylized, I suppose you'd say. The figures had to be cut out of wood, so they were almost cubistic in their design. And the heads were very round and very unreal. And that wasn't really what I wanted to do, but I was very happy to be doing stop motion. So I learned a great deal by working with George. After the war, of course, I got to work with a single figure. But finally, George, I better explain that first the process he had, you had to have, for example, if a figure took a step, one step, you would have 24 separate figures because it takes about 1 second to go from one foot to the other. So you had 24 separate individual figures. The whole process was merely substituting one figure for the next progressively. It was interesting, but not really what I wanted to do. I wanted to work with jointed figures, which I was trained with, a la Willis O'Brien, the technique he used in King Kong.
They would know that the gods have not abandoned them. My land would be rich.
I first met Willis O'Brien, I think, when I was first in high school, long before I worked with George Pal. I was sitting in the study room, I remember this vividly, in high school, and I saw a girl in the distance with a book she was reading, and it had big illustrations of King Kong, and of course I almost went out of my mind. And I went over and introduced myself, and she showed me that it was a script from King Kong. And of course I almost went bananas, and I thumbed through it, and she said that her father had worked with Willis O'Brien at RKO, and she said, why don't you call him up if you was that interested in him? He works at MGM, so I did that. I went home, and the next day I called him at MGM, and he was in the process of making a film called War Eagles. And I told him of my intense interest, and I said I made several dinosaurs, and he kindly offered to have me come over and see all his preparation for War Eagles. And I'll never forget that day. So I piled a lot of my dinosaurs in a suitcase and went over to visit him at MGM. When I walked into his office, I was overwhelmed. There were about 200 gorgeous drawings of the whole process of War Eagles, the whole pattern of the story. Big oil paintings of War Eagles standing on the spikes of the Statue of Liberty's helmet. And I often wonder what happened to all those paintings, because an enormous amount of preparation was put into that. He had a staff of about 3 or 4 artists who were doing nothing but creating images for the story that was being developed at the time. It never left my mind. But Willis O'Brien was very courteous, and he encouraged me, and he gave me some bits of advice. He looked at my stegosaurus, and he said, he's got legs like a sausage, and he says, you ought to study anatomy. And that was a great piece of advice, because I did go to art school and studied anatomy, and tried to develop legs that didn't look like sausages. The costume department does all the detailed research. Of course, I put certain hints on the drawings, but most of it's up to the costume designer, who have to go into it in great detail. That's very important, particularly to a period picture such as this. You want to have them as accurate as possible, and yet enhance the particular actor who's playing that part. We needed a transition, of course, to get Jason to visit the gods. There were many different devices, and of course Beverly Cross, who wrote the screenplay, and Jan Reed, they devised many ways, and we discussed them, and we finally arrived at this particular way of transporting Jason into the realm of the gods, which has to be, in a sense, a rather mystical way, because you'll see in the following scenes how we're able to bring Jason into a small size by him appearing in the hand of Hermes.
You win, my lord. That is, the battle.
I think this is a rather interesting idea of the gods manipulating people through the statues. We used a similar device in Clash of the Titans by having humanity in all little niches in Zeus's palace. And then when he wanted to manipulate their lives, he would bring down the statue and put it in the arena. It was a similar device to this, a means of explaining to the audience how the gods can manipulate the lives of mortal man.
There seems to be a piece missing.
Niall McGuinness's Zeus is more eccentric than Olivier's in Clash of the Titans. Screenwriter Beverly Cross liked this portrayal.
Myth and legends, of course, as I said before, the reasons we chose them is that they have these wonderful ideas built into them, which are many times symbolical. The Cyclops, the giants, the gods, and the various other creatures are all part of the legends, and they symbolize certain fears and concepts of destiny that the Greeks seemed to believe in at that time. I think there's always room for that type of thinking. One often wonders, is fate manipulating your life, or is just pure chance? And one has to really, when you think about it, discard chance and say that something is guiding it, because many times we all seem to have, again, if I may use the expression, the fickle finger of fate guiding us into certain directions. So I think these pictures do reflect a sort of personal idea, which is very difficult to explain in a short period of time.
With only one answer. Search in the
This is a funny bit of business here. While talking about the quest, Zeus has left Hera to dally with a young goddess who beckoned him in the earlier shot. True to character.
Now that you've heard that,
Niall McGuinness makes a very interesting Zeus, very different than Laurence Olivier played it. He's a marvelous character actor. We try to experiment with different ways of portraying these characters, of course, in each picture. Basic pre-production is to create visual images. And on our films, I create about 8 or 10 drawings. I learned this technique from Willis O'Brien, was that he made all these sketches. Many times the drawings were made long before the script was completed or developed even. Many sequences in film are created visually first and then incorporated into the final script. Drawings have a wonderful way of stimulating ideas, particularly in a story conference. So these pre-production drawings that we make on most of our films, I did, I think, about 8 or 10 for Jason, showing the highlights of it. And then we would have a meeting with the writer and the producer and incorporate these ideas into the next rewrite. And that would progress because the script is never just simply written out in a simple form. It all grows by what we call sweatbox sessions, where you take everything apart and analyze it and then replace certain scenes that you think would be much more effective. It grows, and a lot of it grows from the drawings. And if you look at the history of King Kong, you find that Willis O'Brien, before Marion Cooper took over the studio, was working on a film called Creation. And a lot of the scenes from King Kong took parts of Creation and developed them into the script. And you'll see parts of the Lost World in Kong. You'll see many scenes of Creation as well. First of all, I'd like to explain these drawings serve several purposes. I make them quite detailed, these large production drawings, because they also stimulate the backer or the person who's putting up the money, shows them what we're going to put on the screen that's different from what anybody else puts on the screen. So that's another purpose. And then it also shows the director, it shows the cast, what they're going to see on the screen, because many times when we're on the set, there's nothing there. They have to pretend that the creature is there, so it's a form of shadow boxing, so to speak. We sometimes have poles or cardboard cutouts, but those are removed when the scene is actually shot. So these drawings do stimulate the actor's reaction. They help the director and the art director see which way the picture is going. And it sort of sets the tone of the whole picture. So that's a purpose that's very important. And after that, of course, when the script is finally developed after many, many months of working on it by a number of people, why, I make about 400 drawings of little continuity sketches where each scene is broken down into the shot with a description under it of just what is to take place. You have to have that for budgeting. You have to have it so the director knows what's required, the actors know what's required, everybody on the picture knows what we're doing, and it's not just in the hands of one person who, if he should disappear, the picture would come to a standstill. When you get deeper into a film, the detailed designs are all researched very carefully by the art department, and they try to get as accurate Greek interpretation as possible. They take them from vases in the museum, they gather information in books, wherever it's possible. And we try to make it accurate, but then again you have to use a bit of showmanship and make them suitable for the melodramatic concepts that most of these films contain. The construction of the Argo ship was a very interesting evolution. We got a tremendous estimate cost for the construction of it in the budget, and we couldn't afford it. So they finally decided to build it on a barge. So we got an old ship that had a motor on it and built a shell of the Argo over the barge, and it worked out quite well. We would never show the motors functioning, of course, except when we wanted to get home in the evenings after shooting on the set all day. But it worked out beautifully, and I think somebody bought the boat afterwards and used it for other films.
The Argo crew one morning found the crew of the Sir Francis Drake TV series sailing into the area, hoping to film in the same place.
We were off the coast of Naples, down near Polinuro. The ship was brought down so that we could use the boat with the backgrounds that we had picked out in Polinuro. You'll see later on the Isle of Telos, we had the ship actually anchored at that particular location. So we try, if possible, to bring the ship as close to the location as possible.
Hero, queen of the gods. What? Nothing.
I've always felt, ever since being initiated to King Kong and Max Steiner's wonderful score, that music is an enormously important part of a film, particularly a fantasy film. As you know, they're mostly pantomime, so music is extremely necessary, and particularly a composer that is sensitive to the visual image. We see so many films today where the soundtrack, the music, has no relationship to the picture you're looking at. You could put it into any picture and it would be the same. But in the 40s and 50s, and Bernard Herrmann, of course, came from radio, you had the mood music that would fit the situation and express certain ideas to clarify the visual. And of course, Bernard Herrmann was ideal because of his great imagination and his unique way of scoring a film. He always had unique ways of orchestrating his scores. And we were most fortunate to have him score The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. And of course, he did 4 of our films, and Jason was one of them. Of course, you would never tell anybody with Mr. Herrmann's background how to write the music, but we do go over it with Charles Schneer and myself, and many times the director, on where we think the music should start, and if Bernard Herrmann feels it shouldn't, why, he'll tell us so, and the reason why. So we argue these things out ahead of time. But you never know, of course, what goes on in a composer's mind. You may be talking to him, and he has daydreams while he's looking at the film of just what he's going to do. So you have to choose a composer with a good track record that you know can deliver the goods. You can't take a chance too much on newcomers, unfortunately.
You can't row much longer on 3 sips a day.
I suspect that a large part of Herrmann's fandom began with the music that he wrote for Harryhausen's films. How many young viewers, after all, were looking at Citizen Kane or The Devil and Daniel Webster between the years 1957 and 1963? Between The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, The Three Worlds of Gulliver, Mysterious Island, and Jason, however, tens of millions of viewers who weren't even born when Citizen Kane was in theaters and who were too young to understand Hitchcock's Vertigo got an introduction like no other to Herrmann's music.
Sailors always grumble.
These sailors have something to grumble about. Hardly any water.
I'm always on the location. Many times I shoot second unit, because if I'm not occupied on the model unit, why, I shoot second unit many times, and also try to lay out new locations. In order to keep our schedule, we had to many times skip certain shots and put them in afterwards, such as this shot you're looking at now was a traveling mat. We shot a plate of the crew in the background. This was all in the hands of Don Chaffee, and then did Jason much later and put the 2 pieces of film together, which saved a lot of time and got a better effect. We had better lighting on him, and we could get a more subtle means of dialogue than if you shot it actually on the boat. But there's many different ways of creating the illusion. You have to use various techniques, such as traveling mat. For example, if an actor is sick or something during that day's shooting, you have to shoot around the actor and then try to put it together later at a later date so that you don't get too involved in a lot of excess shooting. You can't always match the locations for shot to shot unless you have a budget such as David Lean, where he can afford to sit for days waiting for the clouds to come in just the right position. But we're on such a tight budget that we have to just keep shooting. Whether there are clouds or no clouds behind is immaterial. But the average person doesn't notice that jarring sense unless your attention is called to it. We try to match as close as possible, but that always isn't practical.
Who's Talos? You do mean there's a man there who wants
This
to fight?
scene, of course, sets up the tragedy that befalls Hercules and Hylas, but it has little to do with the myth itself. In the original, Hercules has long since left the Argonauts, and Hylas is long since lost at the point where they confront Talos.
We only used one boat in the picture, except a miniature boat, of course, for certain shots.
This Bernard Herrmann heroic fanfare, by the way, has no stringed instruments. Herrmann was always experimenting with odd configurations. For Psycho, he used an orchestra of only strings. For Jason, he left them out altogether.
Now here's the approach to the Isle of Telos. We used a little place just outside of Polonara for the location. It was very wild. There were no television aerials, and that was very rare in those days. And we went back when we made Clash of the Titans to the same location, and there were beach umbrellas on the beach. A road was plowed through, a tunnel was made. You wouldn't recognize the beach. It was just impossible to shoot there. But we were lucky on this film that we were able, in the Telos scene you'll see later, for example, this area was very deserted, and now there's a caravan camp right in this particular area at present.
In the Greek original, the Argonauts' encounter with Telos takes place after their escape from Colchis with the Golden Fleece. Telos was a giant, the last of the men of bronze. Some branches of myth also identify him as the father of Hephaestus, the god of the forge. He resided on the island of Carpathus and was designated by Zeus as the guardian of the entrance to Europe, his job to keep out all ships that approached. He had only one vulnerable point, and that was a spot on his ankle made of flesh with a vein that pumped blood. In one version of the legend, Medea, on the return voyage of the Argonauts, casts a spell that puts the giant into a daze, which causes him to stumble and open the vein in his ankle, and he dies. His death, as depicted here, is, incidentally, similar to the manner described in the myths.
This sequence of Hercules and Hylas first discovering the Valley of the Gods, where Hephaestus made all the great statues of the gods, this gives another idea of the gigantism of the concept of the gods being bigger than humanity. And we try to justify it in the dialogue and in the logic of the Greek myth. So we chose this valley, and these statues, of course, not to destroy the illusion, were very small. They were miniatures put into the scene at a later date. But I always had an intense interest in relationships between big people and little people. I don't know what it is about it. It just fascinates me. And that's why we made the gods so large. It would be in harmony with the way the Greeks thought of the gods.
I'd like to say something here about the actors. Nigel Green, who was the most articulate Hercules ever seen, became a major character lead through his work in the movies Zulu, Tobruk, The Ipcris File, and The Kremlin Letter. John Kearney, who plays Hylas, was a leading young Scottish actor, and later wrote and produced a one-man show based on the works of Robert Burns that kept him busy into the 1980s.
This is a matte painting. This particular sequence, of course, would be very costly if you were to build it full size. So we built a small section and then used a matte painting to make it look large in the long shots. But you usually build scenes such as this to the scale of the close-ups, and then at a much later date you put in the surround for the long shots and make it look gigantic in the form of spectacle.
Hercules. Well, what is it? You better put it back. Why? Remember what
There was a concept of doing a sequel to Jason, and the picture wasn't that great a success at the box office because people were not too familiar with Greek mythology. And many times it depends on the release date too. Unfortunately, Jason came out at the tail end of a lot of so-called spaghetti mythologies that were made in Italy. A lot of people thought it was a foreign film, Jason and the Argonauts. So it was a bit of a problem for the publicity department to destroy that illusion that it was another one of these muscle man pictures.
The Talos scene is the first extensive stop-motion sequence in Jason, and an unusual one for Harryhausen, in that he had spent his career trying to get the movement of his creations to look natural. For Talos, he had to make its movement look deliberately mechanical. In Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger, he would feature another metallic creation, Minotaur.
The process of animating Talos was something that was in the back of my mind. Of course, the basic idea came from the concept of the statue of Rhodes, the Colossus of Rhodes. I'd always wanted to put that on the screen, and Talos was the result. But his creaking noises and everything were all part of the idea that he was a statue brought to life by the magic of the gods. And of course the gods can do anything, so you might as well believe that a statue of bronze could come to life. And of course the sound effect department was very important here in making just the right noises, because Talos was basically a rubber figure, and the metal noises made him appear to be metallic. When we're choosing locations such as this, we always try to get something really exotic and unusual, such as this arch, such as the rock formation.
Bernard Herrmann's music is a big help here. Herrmann had a way of bringing out the most vivid timbral characteristics of instruments. The brass here reinforces the perceived massiveness of the bronze giant, and the entire score is filled with the richest textured sounds of horns, winds, and reeds.
Talos was about 2 feet high, and he was made of rubber, of course, and then we had large sections of him, a large foot and a gigantic hand, which was about the size of a human hand. And of course, in this particular scene, it was enlarged. But I had to make him stiff and work in a mechanical fashion, because you always associate anything made of metal as a mechanical thing. And it's surprising when you look into Greek mythology or Arabic mythology and you find that they talked about mechanical people. They talked about robots. They didn't call them robots at the time, but even in the Arabian Nights there's a mechanical man that rows people across the river. So there's really nothing new under the sun. The robot was known way back as far as ancient Greece.
The whole Talos episode also reinforces the foolhardiness that the Greek myths ascribed to Hercules, and the dislike that Hera felt for Zeus's son by another mate.
Here, of course, you have a combination of people with the gigantic statue, which in itself is rather awesome. But you can see where the Colossus of Rhodes could have had quite an influence in my thinking in designing this particular setup.
Back! Backwater!
This was done on the miniature. We only had one figure on a 2-foot miniature, and then of course put in the background through traveling matte process. I had the camera on a dolly track so that we could move it through stop motion in between his legs to get that sense of height. I used a very wide-angle lens to give it that grandeur effect. And of course, when you see it in combination with small people in the foreground, it gives that feeling that he's a gigantic structure. These, of course, were shots done in the camera and combined with miniature. We had a very small boat made for Talos to hold in his hands, and that was combined with a larger model that was used for the high-speed photography. If I may say, the secret is that we shoot the background first and then reduce it to the size of the model, which makes the model appear to be large. So it's sort of a reverse perspective type of thing, where you're taking an image of the background and reducing it to such a degree that when you rephotograph it along with the model, it gives this gigantic perspective of size.
Jason shows events out of legend that other filmmakers didn't try to present. The Steve Reeves film Hercules, for example, also depicts the quest for the Golden Fleece, but only shows the human scale elements of the story, conveniently ignoring the most fantastic elements. One of the secrets behind the effectiveness of Harryhausen's work is the superb detail of his miniature sets and models, such as the Argo and the Talos sequence. They're among the best in modern special effects work, and comparable to the renowned model work of Howard and Theodore Lydecker at Republic Pictures around and after World War II.
I've never met the Lydeckers. I've seen them, but it didn't have any influence. No. I think just my sense of detail had more influence, I would say, in O'Brien's work, because he put enormous detail in his models for King Kong, and that rubbed off on me much more so in the early days. I admired the work of the Lydeckers, but they didn't invent detail. It's part of the various tools of the model maker. If you put more detail in it, there's a point, it's interesting in matte painting, there's a point if you put too much detail in, it'll look artificial, and if you don't put enough in, it'll look artificial.
Jason!
I worked alone on all of the sequences on this picture. This sequence took quite a bit of time because it consisted of many different shots. The mechanical quality, of course, was the important thing to put over, that this is a mechanical figure. In the real legend of Talos, he's a figure about 8 feet high, made of metal, and he steps into the fire and gets himself red hot and then embraces sailors and burns them alive. Well, that could hardly be suitable for a screen presentation. So this was an entirely different concept. That's why I went into the concept of the Colossus of Rhodes. It gave it a more believable idea. So many fairy tales and legends are quite grim in their concepts, such as him embracing sailors when he's red hot and burning them alive. It wouldn't be very satisfactory on the screen to see that visually. The statue of Talos, of course, was highly stylized because it's supposed to be a bronze statue, not realistic, only in slight concept. But a lot of it is in the movement rather than the basic design. I think the vacantness of the eyes give it an airy quality because he sort of looks off into space as though some mystical movement is animating him and he's not doing it himself.
Ever since The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, Harryhausen's first feature film of his own, made in 1951, his major creations have usually died grand and glorious deaths in the best operatic style. Talos is no exception, and Harryhausen tells us a bit about how this scene was devised and carried out.
The death sequence was based on the original legend, of course, where Talos cracks up and when they let the ichor run out, why he starts to crack up. He has this hole in his heel, which is part of the original legend, where the ichor runs out when Jason unscrews the metal in the back of his heel, which is supposed to be molten metal. Maybe I shouldn't give away the secret, but the molten metal that's coming out of the back of his heel was a piece of cellophane on a wheel. It's not actually liquid, but it was done through the stop-motion process. Of course, the smoke was added afterwards, but it's actually a wheel of cellophane all squashed up and rotated frame by frame to give the appearance that it's coming out of his heel.
One of the things I remember watching this scene in the summer of 1963 was that you just didn't know what was going to happen here. This is the film's first major stop-motion sequence, and the whole thing was just so startling at the time that you couldn't figure out what the finish would be.
This crack-up was done but with a separate model, which was pre-cracked and filled with clay, And then, of course, I simply scraped the clay out each frame, shot the scene backwards. The model that falls is a third model that was sawed up specifically for that purpose. The difficulties of animating something that is falling is the fact that a falling object has a blur, and sometimes that's difficult to do. There are many ways of doing it, but we try to do it in such a way that it's not too obvious. The reconstruction here of the Argo, of course, was done through a montage, which bridges the time passage. One does it for budgetary reasons as well as for aesthetic reasons.
Harryhausen was notably successful in this period in getting good directors. He explains the unusual role played by directors in his films.
When we started The Seventh Voyage, we got Jerry Duran, who was a former art director. And then Don Chaffee, when we chose him, he was an art director when he started his career in films. And they have more of a technical feel and realize the problems that you have in making this type of film. Because making a film of this nature is not like making a regular film. It's not a director's picture. And most Europeans seem to put everything into the hands of the director. Many times the director doesn't come on our pictures until the whole thing is completely laid out. And it's done for a purpose. It's done in order to make it for a price, a reasonable sum without going over budget, and also for the fact that technically it simplifies. We try to simplify it so that there's not a lot of time wasted on the set. We do a lot of location work. And an art director, a former art director, understands this. And Don Chaffee and I worked together very successfully. And he knew my problems, and he didn't feel that I interfered with him, and he didn't interfere with me. So we got along splendidly. And we made 2 pictures together, 1 Million BC and Jason and the Argonauts. Jason, of course, was a deviation from the Oriental themes of the Sinbad pictures that I stimulated earlier. I made The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms some years ago, and Charles Schneer saw the film. He worked at Columbia. He contacted me and said he had an idea for a giant octopus pulling down the Golden Gate Bridge. And that was our first meeting for that particular film. It came from beneath the sea. And then we did a number of black and white films, and finally we came to our color period, which was The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. And then we've made many films together. We seemed to click when we first met. Charles had an intense interest in putting things on the screen that were a little different than the usual form of films that were made at that time. He wanted to make a much better quality film than just a man in a suit type of picture, which seemed prevalent at that day. Of course, we made a number of contemporary films before we made Jason.
Zeus has other tasks for him.
We tried to put on the screen images that other filmmakers have neglected. I remember it comes from my youth, I suppose, when I saw many of the Sinbad films they did in the early days, and some of the Maria Montez films. They would always talk about the mythical creatures like the Cyclops, the Rock, and you'd never see them on the screen. And the picture ended up as sort of a cops and robbers in baggy pants, or a treasure hunt of some sort. So this is one reason that stop motion is so valuable to these type of films, as you can portray it in the traditional form of storytelling and storybook. And I wanted to put on the screen these wonderful, elaborate images of these never creatures that you'd never seen before, without putting a man in a suit, which destroys the illusion for me. For this particular sequence, the Harpy sequence, we originally were going to shoot the whole film in Yugoslavia. because we found that we could get many people from the army for little or nothing if we had mass scenes of people. I was sent to Yugoslavia to look for locations, and I found quite a number of them. But we had a lot of problems about a month before we were to start shooting. So we fled to Italy, and Don went in one direction to try to find some new locations, and I went down south, and I found this area of Pestum. It's so much better to have a real temple such as this that's 5,000 years old rather than try to build it in a studio. The aging process and everything gives the atmosphere here that is quite desirable, I think, for this particular type of picture. The harpies, we had two sizes of harpies, some smaller size for the distance shot, about the wing spread of 2 feet. And of course the image in the background was projected on a screen, and the harpies animated in front of it, and the whole combination was rephotographed with a camera on new film. So it gave this illusion that the harpies were right in with this ancient building. The harpies are suspended with about 4 wires. In each frame of film, of course, you have to move the wings and raise or lower the harpy in whatever direction it is flowing. But then you're so close to the camera with them that the wires start to show. You have to paint the wires out each frame of film, the same color as the background. This sequence was done with a wire. We pulled it off with a wire and then matched the animation to the speed of the wire so that it gave the illusion that the harpy was actually pulling the belt off the man. Basically, stop motion is the same process as an animated cartoon. Most people realize that animated cartoon is made up of separate drawings. Each frame of film, a new drawing is made on a transparent cell, and each drawing is slightly progressive from the previous drawing. Only instead of using drawings, stop motion animation is basically the use of a three-dimensional model that is jointed with very well-made ball and socket joints so that they'll stay put wherever you move it in any position. It will stay put long enough to take one frame. And of course, it's covered with a rubber substance to simulate flesh and blood. But it is basically the same process as the animated cartoon. But the beauty about stop motion is you can combine them with live action and give the impression that the model is right there in the same picture, and it has a dimension that cartoons combined with live action doesn't have. So that's one of the big advantages.
I can't see yours. Don't flinch.
The actor playing Phineas is Patrick Troughton, a great and sadly underrated British performer who is best known to millions as the second man to portray Doctor Who on the British television series of that title. But Troughton's work in films included Olivier's Hamlet and, even more important, Richard III. In the latter film, he played James Tyrrell, the man commissioned by the king to murder the 2 young princes in the Tower of London. Additionally, Troughton was Olivier's stand-in during Richard III when Olivier was setting up shots as a director, and doubled him for Richard in all of the long shots and action shots. Troughton later played a much bigger role in Harryhausen's last Sinbad film, Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger, and he had a knack for playing eccentrics with a mystical bent. In the BBC adaptation of John Masefield's The Box of Delights, for example, he played Cole Hawlings, the Punch and Judy man who is really the medieval mystic and religious theorist Raymond Lull. He died of a heart attack just prior to appearing at a Doctor Who convention in Georgia during 1988.
And we'll meet it, Phineas. We'll make you the master of the harpies.
If the capture of the harpies here looks different from other video versions, by the way, it's because as scripted, it is supposed to take place at night. We've restored that element to the film for this edition.
The harpies form was designed a lot on my concepts of Dante's Inferno that I got from Gustave Doré. I've always been impressed. He was my mentor in the early days, as he was Willis O'Brien's mentor. I think Gustave Doré was really what you'd call the first art director of motion pictures. And we relied a great deal, I know Obi did on King Kong, of many Gustave illustrations you'll find duplicated on the screen. And it just lends itself so beautifully to the theatricality of this type of picture. So the design of the harpies did basically come from Gustave Doré's ideas. The harpy animation is done mostly by experience, because it's very hard to take a live bat and photograph it. You get blurs many times, you get a lot of blurs. Sometimes it pays to try to blur the wings so that they look a little more natural. But these type of films are dream films, and you're not striving for so much for realism as you are to put over the grotesque idea, the dream quality, which I think is much more important than trying to make it look realistic. You certainly don't want to tell an artist to go out and make a photographic copy of a landscape. So these things all have a certain dream quality, and that's why stop motion is so useful in them, is that it helps give this illusion of the dream quality. And that was half the charm of King Kong, was that he was artificial looking. He was like a dream, a nightmare come true. And that's why this medium is so enhanced, I think, by stop motion, is it gives that Never Never Land quality, which is a great addition.
One reason I think Jason works so well is its structure. It starts with an impressive display with Talos, and then gets better with the harpies. Each effect takes the sense of wonder and the willing suspension of disbelief a notch or two higher.
Animating the harpies under the net, of course, is a difficult problem, because the net sort of restricts what you can do with them. And of course you have to still paint out the wires and animate the net as well. So you have to support the net with wires as well as the harpies, so that they can still flap their wings and go through whatever they have to go through.
Yeah, are you hungry, fella?
I've been asked at several conventions why we never showed close-ups of the harpies, and we did that for a reason, because we wanted to keep them at a distance as creatures of Never Never Land, and I think close-ups would have given a different quality than we got through the way we staged this.
After the clashing rocks, you turn northeast.
Jason's script was the first literate screen treatment of the Greek myths.
What gods protect?
It has an appeal to younger viewers, of course, but there's also a charm and wit and seriousness that appeals to older watchers. Beverly Cross, who took over the screenplay from Jan Reed, was largely responsible for Jason's dramatic structure. An established novelist, playwright, and opera librettist, Cross was a history scholar at Oxford, and, as he said at one time, the more remote the period, the better. He originally came to Columbia as an assistant to Robert Bolt on the screenplay for Lawrence of Arabia. He wrote the battle scenes, and Columbia then brought him together with Harryhausen and Schneer.
We didn't mind having close-ups of the harpies here, this close-up, but we refrained from showing details. Here they were behind bars, and it was usable. We could use the long shots to advantage. We, of course, studied Greek mythology in school, I remember vividly. It never interested me to any great degree until I realized its visual potentials, much later after I got out of high school. But one studies it in school, and I hope they're still continuing to study it, because I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from it. There's always lessons to learn from the past, and one should not discard it as old-fashioned or useless. And I'm afraid many schools today have discarded it in terms of wanting young people to learn more practical things. But we still, in order to plan the future, you've got to know what's happened in the past and how people thought, particularly in ancient times, because the great philosophers were of that period, and there really hasn't been much new invented. It's almost a reinvention of the wheel when you come to think of it, because all the great philosophers were of that particular period, 2,000-3,000 years ago.
The clashing rocks sequence, which leads into the Triton sequence, became the major motif used for the film's ad campaign. In the original legend, by the way, Phineas does tell the Argonauts how to find the Golden Fleece, but the Harpies aren't captured. Rather, they're driven off and nearly killed by two sons of Boreas, Zetes and Calus. They aren't permitted to kill the Harpies, but are told that Phineas will no longer be troubled by them. As to the rocks themselves, Phineas warns the Argonauts to send a dove through first. If it gets through, then it's safe to travel. The dove comes through with only the loss of its tail feathers, and the Argonauts proceed. It is Hera, or Athena, depending upon which branch of the myth one reads, who pushes the ship forward, and they survive with only the tip of its stern damaged. As presented here, the episode is more visually exciting. The presence of the other ship moving in the opposite direction is a good way of showcasing the danger, as well as introducing Medea. It gives Harryhausen a chance to show off his expertise, and then come up with an even more fantastic way of getting the Argo out of danger. You see, each episode cranks the effects higher, and pushes the threshold of what the viewer will accept and absorb. And, fortunately, each effect is that much more ambitious and impressive. Harryhausen explains the way this sequence, which is truly spectacular in theater, was created.
The rock walls were constructed on rubber tires. We had inflated tubes underneath each rock so that we could rock them so they wouldn't be solidly anchored to the floor. And then, of course, the miniature itself was about 8 feet high, and we would build all the rock facing on separately before we would shoot, and we had rods underneath that we pulled out to release the rocks when we needed them. And of course, here's the collapse of the ship in the background, where the miniature ship was actually crushed by the rocks falling.
I'd like to take this chance to talk a bit about Lawrence Nesmith, who plays Argus. He was a favorite of Harryhausen and Schneer, and later played in Harryhausen's The Valley of Gwangi as the professor who helps find the Valley of the Dinosaurs. Other viewers may remember him as Merlin in the film Camelot, or as the first Sea Lord in Sink the Bismarck. He was born Lawrence Johnson in 1908 and attended school with Laurence Olivier. Nesmith joined the Bristol Repertory Company and became an actor and director, and later served as an artillery commander during World War II. He made his return to the West End stage in 1948 in Clifford Odets' Rocket to the Moon, and later distinguished himself in George Bernard Shaw's final play, The Apple Cart. In later years, he became a very busy film actor, and Jason director Don Chaffee used him in Greyfriars Bobby and The 3 Lives of Thomasina, but he probably had his best screen role as Lord Stanley in Olivier's Richard III, where his portrayal brought a gentle, thoughtful humanity to the picture. His other films included The Happiest Days of Your Life, The Barretts of Wimpole Street, The Prince and the Pauper, Cleopatra, and the musical version of A Christmas Carol. Sadly, he died after a long illness during the summer of 1992.
When you read Greek mythology and you think about the clashing rocks, you wonder what it meant, whether you imagined in your mind that the rocks would come together like a vice, or whether... So this was a sort of a happy medium to make it as believable as possible, because you could hardly have it squashed together or squash the ship. It could get on the verge of a comedy, so this was a happy medium we chose.
Turn back, Jason. We're trapped. Trapped, yeah.
The statues you see here was part of the concept of the gods manipulating human lives through these little statues. It was a symbolical concept, and we, of course, tried to design them in a stylized way.
Pray to the gods, Jason. The gods of Greece are cruel. In time, all men shall learn to do without them.
I have several fans who said that this particular sequence where the Triton comes out of the water has affected their lives for years. They were so shocked to see this gigantic man come out of the water. We got a man he had to have a long arm so that it was long enough for the ship to get under, so he was quite a big man. We didn't want to animate the Triton. We used a real swimmer. The Triton was supposed to have the body of a fish, and it gave it that quality of the gods being able to turn themselves into anything they wanted to. Again, we come to the idea of big people and little people. The Triton was a god, and so we tried to make him as large as possible so that he could hold back the clashing rocks. And this was accomplished by what we call high-speed photography. A lot of this was shot in miniature. That 96 frames a second, some of it was shot at 110 frames a second. That means that when the rocks fall, if you left it normal, they would drop instantly and look just like what they are, a miniature. So we shoot it 5 times normal in order to give this mass. And when you see it on the screen, it gives the illusion that the rocks are gigantic. We have a special machine to produce small ripples in the water. You always run into difficulty with splashes, but we felt that this wouldn't matter in this case, that the splashes go quite high into the air and are quite large, because this again is a dream sequence. It's not supposed to be real, it's like a nightmare. The close-up of the ship going under the Triton's arm, the upshot, we had to shoot that as a separate item because we had to get the camera so low and use a wide-angle lens. And that was a special setup that we had to do for that one shot. That was done through the traveling matte process. In Jason, we use the yellow backing process. They call it the sodium process, which Rank developed in the early days. And it's one of the best traveling matte processes I ever came across. That was the basic reason we came to Europe, was to use that particular process in the film Gulliver. Some of the rocks in the early days when we started this sequence were made of styrofoam. And of course, when the rocks fell down into the water, they would float. No one thought of that, even though they were covered with plaster. So we had to remake the rocks and use coal and other items that had a weight to them, so that when they did hit the water, they would sink. But it was rather startling at first to see the rocks float. But each setup, of course, we would pile up new rocks and then photograph it and then keep doing it, so it looked like the rocks were constantly eroding. But it took a number, about 10 takes to get what we needed for the sequence. But not 10 takes of one setup. It was 10 takes of stopping the camera, rebuilding the rocks, and then going on with the next shot, and then stopping the camera and rebuilding the rocks.
We're about to meet Medea, and I'd like to talk about the actress who portrays her, Nancy Kovac. Jason was her first feature film, and she recalls it as a wonderful opportunity to go to Greece and work alongside veteran actors like Lawrence Nesmith. She and Todd Armstrong were the only Americans in the cast, and to make their portrayals fit better, their voices were redubbed, although Kovac got to do some of her own dialogue. Speaking in 1992, she only wished her Medea had more to do, and she expressed some fascination with the notion that there could have been a sequel.
Nancy Kovac was, of course, a contract player to Columbia, and she was cast as Medea. We were going to do a sequel at one time of Medea, and then we started delving into the history of Medea after she met Jason, and it became quite a bloody story. She chopped up her children and threw them out of a cart, and it's something that is very difficult to put on the screen without getting rather bloody. But good heavens, today, the way they show butchering on the screen, I suppose it would be very mild. But even in the opera, I think they avoid a lot of the more grimy aspects of mythology. Because if you get things too bloody, particularly in the time that Jason was released, you would lose your audience, your young people audience, because it would get an X rating, and that's something we didn't want. So one has to modify your concepts many times to allow for that.
Not so powerful as yours.
Are you a priestess?
I serve in the temple of Hecate.
The public love fantasy films. I guess you'd call a lot of the films you see today fantasy, but they're so grim and violent that I think they're quite unwatchable sometimes. I know my wife and I have had to leave the theater several times because what you see on the screen is just so sick-making that why tolerate it? Who needs to pay £5 to be made sick? I think films should have an uplifting quality about them. This concept of the anti-hero in the 60s, I think, destroyed a lot of faith in fantasy. And I think we should come back to the hero and not the anti-hero, because today you have very few heroes on the screen. And I think we all need heroes. My hero was Gustave Doré and Willis O'Brien. And we all need heroes, and somebody talked us out of that. I don't know why anybody believed them in the first place. But Greek mythology, and we tried to get the hero aspect back in Clash of the Titans. But again, this was too rooted in the public's mind that you've got to have a so-called anti-hero who beats up women and explodes people and does all sorts of nasty things to his fellow man. I think this overabundance, dwelling on that type of thing, is terribly dangerous to our society.
We knows our way upstream. Rush the guards and seize the police. We'd be out into the open sea while Aedes and his Culkins were still asleep.
Times have changed since we made these type of films, and tastes have changed. Television has shortened people's attention span to a great degree with the commercials. They're trying to sell you something in 30 seconds that you really don't want. So all this has changed the whole face of the cutting of films, the patience of letting the story develop. I hope the concept of the importance of a story will come back, because to me that's the essence of making a film, is the story content and the visuals. So maybe the whole thing will take a full circle.
It is Jason's story as much as anything else that sets it apart from much of the fantasy done on the screen in the 1980s. When was the last time that anyone saw a major feature film that took its time telling its story, and one for which the telling of the quest is as important as the goal of the quest? It should be remembered that Jason doesn't achieve his goal in this film. He doesn't get back to Thessaly. In fact, in the legend, he never does regain his throne. He is sidetracked, Pelias dies, and the throne passes to his son. And he and Medea begin a tragic period of what might best be called marital sparring, of a kind that would make Danny DeVito's War of the Roses look like light comedy. In many ways, Jason makes me think of another costume adventure film that, on its surface, seems to fall short of what it promises, except that it doesn't. Howard Hawks' Red River. Red River promises us Indian trouble, but except for one 5-minute vignette, we barely glimpse any. It promises us a gunfight between Montgomery Clift's Matt Garth and John Ireland's Cherry Valance that never happens. And it promises us a fight to the death between Garth and John Wayne's Tom Dunson and doesn't deliver it. But nobody minds. And that's because in a good adventure film that brings off everything it sets out to do, getting there is the point and the fun. The quest, not the goal, is the thing. That Jason can draw such a strong response just from the telling of a tale lies in the power of the tale. The questing hero and the process of separation, initiation, and return is central to the importance of the quest in psychic terms. These are processes that go back virtually to the dawn of human understanding and pervade virtually all religious mythology. Look at Moses and the burning bush, the temptation of Jesus in the desert, and our popular culture. Consider heroes from Superman to Mr. Spock and their instances of ritualistic achievement of self-awareness. The case can be made that it is all but ingrained in our being, like a preconscious collective memory. Jason plays out a ritual on screen, deftly and finely thanks to Harryhausen's work and Beverly Cross's script and Don Chaffee's vigorous direction. That is more powerful than the stories that generally get the attention of movie makers today, with the exception of the occasional effort by Steven Spielberg and George Lucas.
In some versions of Jason, this whole sequence is cut out. In this particular shot of the hall, of course, it would be outrageously expensive to build a set right up to the ceiling. In fact, you'd go probably through the roof of the soundstage. So we build a set up to a certain height, and then the rest of it, of course, is painted and put in afterwards as a matte shot.
This dance music sounds more Arabic than Greek. It is one of Herman's freer-flowing pieces of music in the film. Most of Jason's score takes the form of either marches or effect music. This is an instance of what is known as real music that is part of the on-screen action.
We had a statue made for the close-ups, a special one that was about 5 feet high, with the 3 heads of the god, just for close-ups when she was dancing at that particular moment. But the long shots, we had the base of a statue up to about the middle of it, was built full size, and then the rest of it was painted.
We're hearing some more of that very crisp Bernard Herrmann scoring here. Part of his secret was putting the listener very close to the orchestra. It sounds like we're sitting right in front of the wind and reed players here, while Jason's heroic fanfare practically puts us in the bells of the brass instruments. Jason was the last of 4 films that Bernard Herrmann scored for Harryhausen and Schneer. According to Stephen C. Smith in his Bernard Herrmann biography, The Heart and Fire Center, Schneer had been a fan of Herrmann's ever since the 1930s, when he'd heard Herrmann's music on the radio, and it was Schneer who approached Herrmann about scoring The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. Up to that point, Harryhausen's work on screen had been more a beneficiary of luck than anything else. The first Ray Harryhausen film that I ever saw was his first, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which was originally shot as an independent production. It was directed by Eugene Laurier, who had been Jean Renoir's art director and who had long wanted to direct a film of his own. The picture, all about a dinosaur frozen in the Arctic ice reawakened by nuclear tests, derives part of its plot from a Ray Bradbury short story. Bradbury had first thought of the idea for his story, The Foghorn, on a sleepless night when he was walking near the remnants of a ruined roller coaster in Pacific Ocean Park, and he heard the Venice foghorn. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms was shot for a total budget of just over $200,000, and its quality was something of a miracle. It had a good cast: Paul Christian, Paula Raymond, Cecil Kellaway, Kenneth Tobey, and Lee Van Cleef, and future Outer Limits alumnus Louis Morheim was one of the authors, with Laurier in the director's chair. In his book, My Work in Films, Laurier recalled that the material featuring the human actors took about a month to film, including all of the plates that were needed to show the animated dinosaur moving through New York. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms had been made by producers Jack Dietz and Hal Chester to distribute themselves, but they realized when Harryhausen and Laurier were finished that they had something much better than they'd bargained for. They ended up showing the picture to Jack Warner, and when the screening was over, Warner asked his own head of distribution how much he thought it would have cost Warner Brothers to make a movie like that, and he guessed $1 million. So Dietz sold the film to Warner Brothers for $500,000, and it ended up becoming the studio's top-grossing film of that year. Warner Brothers added a score by David Buttolph, which replaced what Harryhausen recalls as a track of light classical music used in the original version. He had hoped that Max Steiner, who had scored King Kong, would write the music. Charles Schneer saw The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and he and Harryhausen hooked up for their first film together, It Came from Beneath the Sea, about a giant octopus terrorizing the Pacific. It wasn't long after that the two of them did Earth versus the Flying Saucers. Those films were done for Columbia Pictures on low budgets, using the studio's pool of technicians, stock music, and contract players, and neither looked or sounded as good as The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. It was when Schneer organized Morningside Productions in 1957 that he and Harryhausen acquired the ability to upgrade their films. Their first Morningside production, 20 Million Miles to Earth, used the same stock music and a lot of Columbia personnel. It even used the leftover Minesweeper set from Stanley Kramer's The Caine Mutiny as the interior of the wrecked spaceship. But it was based on an idea of Harryhausen's, and it did feature a talented director, Nathan Duran, who worked on 2 subsequent Harryhausen features, Behind the Camera. Duran knew how to work with actors quickly and effectively. He had a knack for getting good performances under low-budget conditions. Under the name Nathan Hertz, he guided Allison Hayes, Yvette Vickers, and John Agar through The Attack of the 50-Foot Woman and The Brain from Planet Arris, which was sort of the storyboard for The Hidden, during the same period. In any case, the second Morningside picture, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, was the film with which Harryhausen and Schneer showed what they could do. It was also the first color film to make extensive use of stop-motion animation. According to Harryhausen, the problem with using color was that stop-motion animation required multiple exposures, and the color would deteriorate with each new level of exposure. What he did was to flare the film, to partially expose it, which reduced the deterioration of the color. Each successive production after Sinbad got progressively more ambitious. Mysterious Island in particular seems impressive today. It was written by Jules Verne as a sequel to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which meant that it would inevitably be compared to the Disney movie. It was done on a fraction of Disney's budget, but in many ways is just as impressive. It was better written, and the director, Cy Enfield, an underrated filmmaker responsible for a brilliant film noir called Try and Get Me, and also the director of Zulu, did a superb job. Jason was the artistic peak of their work, a clever, literate, almost perfect script depicting a heroic quest in its most universal form, with a dream cast and almost perfect timing. Unfortunately, interest in fantasy films plummeted during the mid-1960s. Just as World War II had done in the Flash Gordon serials, the success of the space program and the growing social strife of the 1960s would make films about mythology and magic seem quaintly irrelevant. Harryhausen's first Men in the Moon was something of a box office disappointment because it came out at a time when fascination with the space program had also partly waned. His next film, 1 Million Years BC, clearly benefited from the presence of Raquel Welch. It is the only one of Harryhausen's films, I should say, that my father attended. Although people ended up at least as impressed by Harryhausen's dinosaurs as they were by Welch's anatomy. The Valley of Gwangi didn't have Raquel Welch, but it was a better movie, and probably would have done well in any decade but the 1960s. It could have been another Lost World, but Warner Brothers, which had undergone a change in management while it was in production, never knew what they had. By the time they were back at Columbia in 1972 for the Golden Voyage of Sinbad, Harryhausen and Schneer had latched on to an oncoming revival of interest in fantasy films. The second Sinbad movie became their biggest success in a decade and heralded the reawakening of interest in the entire genre, which would lead to a successful reissue of Harryhausen's Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. Alas, Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger had the misfortune to come along just as the public had developed a taste for space-based fantasy, a la George Lucas. Harryhausen himself is probably the closest thing to a true auteur that one can find in filmmaking outside the ranks of directors and producers. His movies all start with his special effects and end with his special effects, which are the last elements of the film to be finished. And, as he has said, the director's work is already laid out when filming begins. Some of the quality of each film rests with how well the directors and actors do their job, but it is Harryhausen, with the writer that he and Schneer have chosen, that determines what that work will be. Actually, there were sections of Jason's script that proved unfilmable. In the original, Jason was to travel to Mount Olympus on a fiery chariot. This was dropped because neither Harryhausen nor the art director could devise a fiery chariot that wouldn't have required an explanation to the audience. I'd like to say a few words here about Don Chaffee, the director of Jason. These are not director's films, of course, and Chaffee only did 2 films with Harryhausen, Jason and 1,000,000 Years BC, but they gave him a chance to show what a great action director could do in the right setting. Born in England in 1917, Don Chaffee joined the art department at Gainsborough Studios during World War II and headed the department after the war. The studio produced many of the handsomest and most famous films in its history at this time: Madonna of the Seven Moons, The Wicked Lady, and The Weight of the Stars, among them. His short film, The Mysterious Poacher, won a medal at the Venice Film Festival, and suddenly Chaffee was in demand as a director. Later on in the 1950s, he did a series of successful thrillers starring Richard Attenborough, but in the 1960s he found success doing children's films. For Disney, he directed Greyfriars Bobby and The 3 Lives of Thomasina, starring Patrick McGoohan. Chaffee also did excellent work on the Patrick McGoohan series Danger Man, Secret Agent, and The Prisoner, and on The Avengers. Jason was the high watermark of his career. Beverly Cross recalls that he knew how to move the actors quickly through their scenes, yet also get good performances out of them. He had an intuitive sense of how action would play in the camera and on the screen, and he went at it with the precision of an artist.
No, not you, Polyjuice. But others! You stay aboard with the rest of the men and guard the ship.
We're coming up on the Hydra sequence, on which Ray Harryhausen has some reflections and recollections.
The Hydra sequence, well, that was, of course, most exciting a challenge because of the 7 heads of the Hydra. Like the skeletons, we had 7 skeletons. 7 is a magic number all through mythology and the Bible. So we wanted to keep it in that realm of 7. I grew quite excited about this sequence that we would have the Hydra fighting Jason. And it was quite a challenge to keep all 7 heads going in proper directions, particularly if the telephone would ring, I would have to stop and answer it. And you'd wonder which head is the 6th head going back or forward. But inasmuch as there was never a creature like this in the history of the animal world, I had to invent, of course, how it would move, similar to a serpent. This was the result. I try to remember when I leave, particularly for lunch, that I make notations. Is the 3rd head going forward or backward? And you have an idea of the sense of how the thing is moving in your mind, so if you're not too badly interrupted, well, you can usually pick it up as you go along, particularly after lunch. When we shot the production side of it in Italy, we of course had to stage Jason, as you see him here, battling thin air, and then the Hydra was put in afterwards. The whole sequence, I think, would take about a month and a half, or maybe 2 months to do. It's one of my favorites, the Hydra sequence. Very few people ever ask me questions or even acknowledge that it existed. We want to make the Hydra look as authentic as possible, so I try to simulate the idea of the snake body and along with the reptilian concept of a dinosaur. So it's a combination of ideas. The main idea, I did the drawing first, of course, and then the model was made from the drawing. All the movement of the Hydra was created actually at the time of animation. It was very difficult to pre-plan. I pre-planned the cuts and where the Hydra should move to, but only in the broadest sense. Here you see him actually putting the sword in the Hydra, which was quite a tricky scene to work out. I won't go into detail. I've got to keep some secrets. I can't tell all of my tricks because, good Lord, it's like a magician. If he tells you before he does the trick how he pulls a rabbit out of the hat, you're no longer interested in the trick. We try to eliminate shooting a scene over as much as possible by trying to get it the first take. And of course, there are occasions when you have to reshoot the whole scene.
The Hydra was the first of two great snake-like reptilian creatures devised by Harryhausen. The other is Medusa from Clash of the Titans. Clash of the Titans in many ways is a big-budget follow-up to Jason. The difference is Don Chaffee. Beverly Cross says that Chaffee would have moved the action in the later film a lot faster than the director they actually had did.
Get the fleece.
The Golden Fleece has many different concepts. In Greek mythology, of course, certain people say that it was the fleece of a wool that was put in the bottom of a river in order to collect the nuggets. And that's how it got the name the Golden Fleece. But we tried to make it more of the fairy tale concept, that the Golden Fleece was actually a magical skin of a lamb that glittered like gold. We put a little glitter in it, and sometimes critics objected to that, but it gave it sort of a magical feel to it. I think if you get too logical with mythology, you lose part of the magic of it.
The quest for the Golden Fleece links up with another Greek legend. The fleece itself, by one tradition, was from the magical ram that had helped the young prince and princess, Phrixus and Hel, flee from the usurpers of their parents' kingdom. It flew them across the world. Hel was lost in the sea and gave her name to the Hellespont. The ram carried Phrixus to Colchis, where, in gratitude, he offered the ram in sacrifice to Zeus and the fleece to King Aeetes. Tradition said that it had the power to heal, which becomes a key plot element of the film.
Deliver to me the children of the Hydra's teeth. The children of the night!
The flame sequence was, of course, double printed in. The fire was put in afterwards. We built a big bonfire out in the field at night and shot the fire at night against black sky and then double printed it into the set.
The Children of the Hydra's Teeth is one of the inspired adaptations made for the film. In the best-known version of the Jason legend, the Colchians pursue Jason's ship and go through a series of encounters with him, in which he also ends up in conflict with Medea, a foreshadowing of events to come, as her jealousy and madness ultimately destroy everyone around them. They've made Medea far more benign here. In the legend at this point in the story, she has murdered her own brother to help Jason. That was Nancy Kovac's only objection to the role. When we talked in the spring of 1992, she joked about wanting to play Medea in the sequel, in which she would get to murder her husband and manipulate the destruction of everyone around him, and then fly off in an enchanted chariot. One of the reasons, by the way, that the script was changed at this point was that it did involve Jason going into the underworld and encountering the three-headed dog Cerberus. At the time, animating a three-headed dog was considered beyond the means of the film's budget, and the entire vignette didn't move the plot along significantly. So instead, they emphasized the healing powers of the fleece and saved Medea in that way. The reference to the Golden Fleece in the original title, by the way, created something of a problem. Harryhausen's films can be years in production. It was 5 years from the start of script discussions on Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger until the release of the film. Jason was begun in 1961 and not released until 1963. In the interim, Harryhausen and Schneer heard about an Italian-made fantasy film that was called The Golden Fleece that was going into release shortly before Jason was due to reach theaters. So Jason and the Golden Fleece became Jason and the Argonauts.
It has the power to heal.
No composer ever used harps purely for effect in the way that Bernard Herrmann did, as the music in this sequence reminds us. The harp was one of his favorite instruments for depicting the unfolding of something wonderful. He used 9 of them for one section of Beneath the 12-Mile Reef to depict the world at the bottom of the ocean, and 12 of them in Journey to the Center of the Earth in showing the descent of the travelers into their new world.
It's true. He does have the power to heal.
We're at the celebrated skeleton scene. Harryhausen reflects upon it and the beginnings of his work in stop-motion animation in his parents' home in the 1930s.
I was an only child, and of course, they always worked along with me. They never tried to discourage me, and they always took an interest. My mother was artistically minded, and she used to help me make papier-mâché heads for the puppets. I got interested in string puppets for a while. But I found there was a tremendous limitation, and that's why after seeing King Kong, I became intrigued with the idea of using a movie camera and the process of stop motion.
Rise up, you.
I'm going to leave the rest of this narrative to Ray Harryhausen and his reflections. I'd like to thank Paula Kelly Chaffee, Nancy Kovac, Beverly Cross, and Ray Harryhausen for their contributions to and assistance on this project. This is Bruce Eder, thanking you for joining us for the Criterion Collection edition of Jason and the Argonauts.
Of course, this particular sequence of sewing the dragon's teeth is very important to the story of Jason and the Argonauts. In the original story, of course, rotting corpses appear, which would be rather distasteful, I think, if you saw that on the screen. So we gave the whole image a clean-cut skeleton, which would be much more interesting, I think, and less horrific. And we weren't out to make a horrific sequence. We were out to make an unusual sequence based on the concept that if you sew dragon's teeth, that something will happen in this world of magic. The first skeleton I did was, of course, in Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, and it was very successful, so that's another reason I wanted to put skeletons in this sequence instead of rotting corpses, because you could get much more out of it, much more drama and much more exciting concept. And of course, Bernard Herrmann's music was superb, because you have a problem with this type of sequence where if you're not careful, it gets to be comical. And we didn't want it to be like a cartoon. I think Bernie's music was just suitable, perfect for this sequence.
Destroy them! Kill! Kill them all!
In this sequence, which was so complicated, having 7 skeletons all at once, we had stuntmen who were excellent swordsmen portray the skeletons, each skeleton. Then we rehearsed that over and over and each stuntman had a number on his back so I could keep track of where they were moving. The actors would rehearse with the stuntmen, and then after maybe 12 rehearsals, we would shoot the scene without the stuntmen, and by that time the actors knew just what to do and where their movements were to take place. We timed it sort of like a choreography in a ballet so that you could repeat it on counts. Because as you can see, some of it gets quite complicated when you have so many working at once. The skeletons became a big problem. They were only 8 inches high, and the problem was to hide a skeleton within a skeleton, which is asking a lot. I had to conceal all the metal ball and socket joints within the framework of a very thin-looking skeleton. My father actually made the armatures for them on a lathe. But as I said before, they're 8 inches high, so I was working on a very small scale. To animate 7 skeletons with 5 appendages all moving at the same time in synchronization with the actors, sometimes I would only get about 13 frames a day. And of course the accountants would get quite upset because they thought I was wasting money. But it did take a long time to position each skeleton and to keep a smooth flowing action. This gentleman that's fighting the skeleton, he was our stunt arranger. His name is Fernando Poggi, and he was with us on a number of films, and he arranges all the stunts. He's an excellent swordsman, and he arranged the whole sequence that I laid out so that it was practical from a swordsman's point of view. At one time I studied fencing for the 7th voyage, and I threw my hip out of joint taking that unusual stance. But I did want to get the feel of the sword, so I did take lessons from the fellow in Hollywood, Faulkner, who taught many of the actors how to use the sword. I tried to give the skeletons a demonic look because they are, shall we say, antagonists of this particular situation. And it gives them more character if they look rather evil, because skeletons for some reason have always been associated with evil. I don't know why, but they're also the concept of death. And how do you kill death? Have you ever asked that question? We had a stuntman double, of course, when Jason leaped off the cliff, and he had 90 feet with full-dressed armor, and it was quite a dangerous dive with all the paraphernalia he had to wear. We had 7 plaster skeletons made, and we chucked them over to follow Jason down. We got it all in one take. How would I like people to remember my work? Well, just that they enjoy it. I get many fan letters, and at the ASIFA Awards, I had many people come up to me and say how our films have changed their life. And I think that means more to me than anything else, is that our films have meant more to people than just a few hours of entertainment. Young people have come up and said that our films have changed their point of view, got them interested in art, got them interested in mythology, which I think is a wonderful thing. And just as King Kong got me interested in music, after trying to trace Max Steiner's score, I found out it was very Wagnerian, and I became interested in Wagner's music and the classics. The picture opened up a whole new world to me that I wouldn't have been conscious of. And I'm so happy today to hear these people say that our pictures have opened up a whole new concept for them. And so the snowball rolls on.